So what I am about to tell you guys is going to make it look like October has been my worst reading month of the year. And to be honest, it has not been that great, but it also has not been as bad as I'm about to make it seem. So a little disclaimer before we get started, we have had a fan fitted in the cellar that is going into boost mode a little bit too frequently. So the people that installed it are coming to adjust that at some point in the next couple of days. But for now, there might be a faint buzzing in the background of the video. It should be fine while I'm talking, but just in case you hear that, that is what it is. I'm very aware of it and it's irritating the hell out of me. But into October. So October was the month of the Spookoplathon, which is a readathon that I host. It's a readathon that I love to participate in because it's so fun, and I did not do as well as I wanted to. I only made it around the board 1.5 times. I did kind of anticipate this happening. I have a little bit more on when I do readathons, and I'm also going to Egypt. When you see this, if you're watching it when it's posted, I am currently in Egypt. So as we get closer and closer to the end of the month, I am less focused on reading and more focused on preparing everything for going away. So that resulted in not a terrible reading month by any means, but a little bit of a lackluster one. And also I am going to be wrapping up October a little bit before the month actually ends. So I am going to read at least one more book in October, which is Meddling Kids by Edgar Cant's Hero. I'm currently 167 pages into this. I should have this finished by the end of the month, but because I have to film this wrap up a little bit earlier than usual, we are going to be counting this as my first book of November instead, which makes October look like my worst reading month of the year, but it is not quite. It's not the best by any means, but it is also not quite the worst. So first up, I guess, getting into my statistics for October, I read 3,014 pages across 7 books. That is just counting the books that I completed in the month, not the ones that I DNF'd and not Meddling Kids. And this broke down to an average of 97 pages per day. For the star ratings, I had 5 3 stars, very mediocre, and 2 4-star reads, breaking down to an average of 3.28 stars per book. For the demographics, we have very little to report. I read 7 adult books. For the formats, I read 5 standardly formatted novels, I listened to 1 audiobook, and I read 1 ebook. For the genres, I had 3 fantasy, 3 fantasy romance, and 1 book that I would classify as horror. And then finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, 3 of them are books that I have hauled in 2024. 2 of them are from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2024. 1 of them I read on KU, and 1 was a book that I borrowed from my library. So I started off my month with episode 9 of Shelve It or Scrap It, which was really fun. It was a Spookoplathon round, and that did really hold me up for most of the month, and then put me in a little bit of a slump for the second half of the month because I was reading quite intensely during that episode, and it was all like first books in fantasy series. So I will link it if you guys want to check it out before I talk about the books here. But the first book that I read for that video was a 4-star read, and that was the Jasad Heir by Sarah Hashem. Now, Sarah Hashem is actually a Egyptian American author, which is kind of on theme because I'm going to Egypt, but I did not know that when I picked this up. This is just an enemies to lovers fantasy romance that I've heard quite good things about, and I really wanted to check it out for myself. So I read this for the Pentacle prompt, which is to read a 5-star prediction. It didn't quite hit that mark for me, but it did get a solid 4 stars. So in this one, we are following a young woman called Sylvia, and she is the lost heir of a conquered kingdom. In the origins of this world, there were 4 kind of deities that all represented like one of the kingdoms of this world, and they all had magical powers and they were all getting a little bit out of hand. So this 5th kingdom was created, and that was essentially created to police the rest of them. Now, over generations, the magic faded from the citizens of the kingdoms, apart from in Jasad. And when Jasad ended up being such a powerhouse in this world, Nizal, which is the kingdom that was created to police the rest of them, came in and killed the royal family and all of the people, like all of the citizens of Jasad. So our main character did manage to escape. She was took under the wing of this like abusive exiled general until she ended up separating from the general, and she's been living in the border towns of some of the other kingdoms. So in this world, it is now illegal to possess magic. Like, you will be executed if you have any magic. So essentially they are hunting down and executing all of the Jazadis. Our main character has done everything that she possibly can to hide her magic, and she ends up up getting cornered by a Nizali soldier who then threatens her. So in retaliation, she obviously kills him, and this leads her into a series of events that results in the Nizali heir finding her. And she very much tries to hide her magic from him. She's actually also been cuffed, which means that her magic has been restrained, and she should have broken free of these cuffs by now, but her magic is still restrained and she can't figure out why that is. And also she has nobody to ask because she would be executed if anybody found out that she had magic. And the Nizal heir actually has the ability to sense people with magic, but this is hindered by the cuffs that Sylvia wears. So he is very suspicious of her and is keeping a very close eye on her, and they end up kind of in a situation where they are forced to live very closely together during a period of time where Sylvia is kind of denying that she has any magic, and the love interest Aaron is absolutely sick of her shit and knows that she's a liar. So like I said, this is an enemies to lovers story, so across the course of this story those two grow a little bit closer together. Something that I really loved about this one is the juxtaposition of the personalities of our main characters. So Aaron is quite a stoic, like pensive, quiet love interest, and Sylvia is much more chaotic. So what this kind of results in is Sylvia just running around creating chaos and Aaron just kind of staring at her like, what is going on? And I really love that dynamic throughout here. This does also feature a series of trials within the story, but I wouldn't go into this if that is something that you really like, because it is quite towards the end of the book and it's also something that I felt could have been expanded upon a little bit more, with obviously like trials and tournaments are such a well-loved part of fantasy stories. I feel like it was very much underdone and understated within this series. Something else that I didn't love about this is that I felt like the events of the end and one of the characters' like reactions to the end was not necessarily unbelievable, but it happened a little bit too quickly and lacked, I guess, some like inner monologue in and a little bit of nuance to really flesh out the character's motivations in that instance for me. And so I felt like it was a little bit of a quick like throw in right at the end of the book to kind of set it up for book 2. Overall though, this reminded me of some quite nostalgic fantasy romance series that I love. Think about things like Throne of Glass and We Hunt the Flame, where we have like a strong fantasy plotline, not a unique fantasy plotline by any means. It is one that we've seen before, like a lost heir from a conquered kingdom is trying to like reinstate her throne. We also have like a group of rebels in here who are trying to reinstate the Jasadis and rescue Jasadis, and they are also looking for Sylvia because they know that she's this lost princess and she just wants a peaceful life for herself, which very much mirrored The Will of the Many, which I also read not that long ago. So it's not a unique setup by any means, but I think that it was like pretty well done and reminded me a lot of things like We Hunt the Flame and Throne of Glass that I have read and loved in the past. I then read one that I was very excited about that disappointed me a little bit, and that is Mistress of Lies by K.M. Enright. So this is a story that features vampires and also blood magic. We are following a young woman called Shan who kills her father so she can become the head of the family. She is a little bit power hungry, but also her father is not a very nice man, and anybody who is not a blood worker in this world is treated poorly, which Shan should like fully believe in this ethos as a blood worker, but her twin brother is actually unblooded, like he's ungifted, and so she has seen how people like her brother are treated and she wants to kind of right that injustice. We are also following a young man called Samuel in here, and he is unblooded and he has grown up in the slums, but he has this dark gift where he can he can order anybody to do whatever he wants and they have to do it. So he has kept this ability a secret, but it is believed that he is the heir of a lost line in this world, and so people are actually looking for him. And lo and behold, our main character Shan is one of these people, because she believes if she finds this guy, if she reinstates him back into the nobility, then she can kind of ride his coattails to power because he's the last heir of this like very, very influential line in this world. Shan is also masquerading as a little bit of a vigilante figure at night, where she goes out into the area that's like of the city that's populated by the working class and collects information that she uses to help people. So this is also a book that features a poly relationship. It has representation for trans characters in here and characters all across like the spectrum of queerness, and I really liked the atmosphere of this going into it. I really enjoyed like the first 200 pages, and in terms of atmosphere, style, and setting, it reminded me a lot of like Kingdom of the Wicked by Kerry Maniscalco. It had the same kind of tone and was placed in like around the same time in history based on like the architecture and like the society and things like that. So I was really getting into it, but I felt like this book was very much one note. Like normally for the first 100, 200 pages of a new fantasy series, you expect it to kind of be on this like one note because we're getting accustomed to the world, we're growing close to the characters, we're just learning about everything that's going on in this story. But then eventually you expect it to kind of like increase the pace or increase the tension or become more intriguing. And this never really kind of peaked at any point for me. It stayed on that one flat note for the entirety of the time that I was reading this book. Now, this has been marketed as a romantasy, and I think that that is very, very inaccurate. I think that this is a political fantasy that has a romantic subplot in there. It has nowhere near as much romance for it to be a romantasy, in my opinion, and the romantic relationships in here are not compelling enough for it to be like the main kind of draw of this story. I never really felt any of the attraction or the tension between the characters, and while we do have a couple of smutty scenes that I thought were good in terms of like the smut, the tension and the relationship and the attraction between the characters, I just wasn't feeling at all. And that element of this felt completely flat for me. There is also a mystery element of this book because right at the beginning, Samuel stumbles across a body that has been kind of mauled. And Shan ends up being the person who is charged with investigating this series of murders. And she does nothing about it throughout this. Like, people keep dying, and every time they do, she's like, oh my god, like, we need to find who's done this. But she never investigates anything. I also felt like it was very obvious who was the murderer, and because the book like obviously attempted to divert your attention a little bit and cast suspicion on other people, it felt even more obvious who the murderer was when the people that the suspicion was cast on was not even like a believable suspect, in my opinion. So yeah, this one started strong but ultimately just went downhill in the second half. So I gave it like a very low 3-star because I did really like the atmosphere and the setting, and I thought that they were very strong, but then the romance, plot, the pacing just didn't work for me. Another one that I sadly did not love that is made even more disappointing in light of a book that I read later on in the month is Evocation by S.T. Gibson. So this is S.T. Gibson's 2024 release. I read this one for the spooky prompt because it features like psychics and mediums, which I love psychic and medium stories. I just love the atmosphere that is generally created in stories that have those elements. And this one is once again a book that features a poly relationship. I think that the relationship was done a little bit better in this one, but the focus on romance in this book, or the excessive focus on romance, is what actually killed this one for me. So in this one we are following David, and David is a medium. There's like mediums, psychics, sorcerers, all of them are a little bit different in this world, but David was essentially cursed. Like, his family made a deal with the devil 1,000 years ago, and in exchange for 1,000 years of servitude, the family would be gifted with like an excessive amount of charisma and also the ability to commune with the dead. So David is a very ambitious man. He's also very privileged. He comes from old money, and he is, I think he's a lawyer in the day, and at night he performs like seances. He gets in contact with people's dead loved ones and passes messages along for them. So he's pretty much working 24/7. He's a real ambitious guy. And right at the beginning of this book, he goes and tries to contact like a woman's dead husband, and he hears this like really loud, ominous voice in his head. So that causes him to go and speak to one of his old friends, Reese. Now, they used to date back in college. That's about 10 years before the start of this story. Reese is now married to a woman named Moira. They actually haven't spoken in a couple of years because of a massive argument that they had that is alluded to at the beginning of this book, where they decided, or Reese decided, that he just did not want to speak to David ever again. David can be quite careless of others' feelings in the way that privileged people can be. Like, he's used to getting getting what he wants, and he's used to kind of everybody going along with his whim, and it was that kind of created a little bit of a rift between them. But David has to try and rekindle his friendship with Rhys because he thinks that Rhys, who is not only a sorcerer but a scholar, will be able to find the information or know something a little bit about why David is possessed and how to make it stop happening. Moira, who is Rhys's wife, is also a perspective in this book, and she is quite gifted in things like healing and also like fortune telling, like tarot readings and things like that. And this magic has been passed down the maternal line of her family, and she is very wary of David. They've never really had a relationship, but she's also quite wary of him because she knows that the way that he's treated Rhys in the past has upset Rhys, and she doesn't want her husband to go through that again. So Moira, because of her healing gifts, also ends up trying to help David when it becomes clear that Rhys is going to get dragged into this and try and remove the entity that is possessing David before it gets too late. So throughout this book, David is deteriorating. Like, he starts off fine, but as this possession goes on longer and longer, he gets more and more sick. And because of that, you would assume that solving this problem, like removing this entity, is of some urgency. Like, it's something that we should be taking seriously and we should be moving along with quite quickly. And while they are always kind of moving along with that, like it's always happening in the background, the middle 100 pages of this book is very focused on a potential romantic relationship between the three of them. Now, Rhys and Moira have a very healthy marriage, and so they talk through every single possible issue that might come up, including what is happening with David in great length. And that is fine. Like, I'm really happy that they have a healthy marriage, but listening to them discuss like the minutiae of their life and like these possible issues is just not really interesting to read when we also have this possession story going on in the background. And so I really wanted to see them delve more into like the psychic medium elements of this story and focus less on talking about potentially having an open marriage or a polyamorous relationship. So yeah, sadly this one got derailed a little bit plot wise for me, which resulted in me giving this like a low 3 stars. I felt like it had promise. I really liked the writing style. I actually kind of liked the characters up until they started to annoy me, but the focus on romance in the middle, I just felt this book was only 300 pages and it didn't need such a heavy focus on the relationship. That could have been happening more in the background, but I felt like it was a little bit overpowering for me in this one. Alongside all of those, I was also listening to the audiobook of New Spring by Robert Jordan. This is the prequel in the Wheel of Time series. So if y'all don't know what Wheel of Time is, it is, I smile every time I say this because I give the same synopsis over and over again, and because of how complex this series is, it's also kind of vague. But this is set in a world where the same things happen over and over again, and each turning of the wheel is an age. So while this is happening, there is an eternal struggle between the forces of light and dark going on, and over the ages the dark side has been winning. So in this series we are following this age's Dragon Reborn, who is a pivotal figure in this fight between good and evil, as he hopefully starts to tip the scales from the dark and towards the light for good. And he also has a handful of friends who are Tarveran, which are people who are able to alter the weave of the world, so alter the events that are usually set in stone, to help him on his journey. So this, being the prequel, actually does not follow him at all. It follows Moiraine, who is an Aes Sedai, in a time where she was training to become an Aes Sedai, so she's not even like qualified yet. And also we are following Lan, who is he's the heir to a kingdom that no longer exists because of these dark forces have created something called the Blight, which is where all of these like demonic creatures are pushing more and more into the world, and like lands have been overtaken. When we start the Wheel of Time series, he is Moraine's warder, which is essentially like a bodyguard that the Aes Sedai have. They're very, very closely bonded. So in this book, we're following like where they first meet, and we're also seeing the beginning of Moraine's lifelong mission, like the thing that she dedicated herself to, which is finding the Dragon Reborn, because they know that he's going to be such a pivotal figure in this age. The Aes Sedai are looking for him so that they can keep him safe and also foster him and like train him to prepare him for the fight of his life, like his fated destiny that he needs to achieve. I was a little bit disappointed by this one. I did enjoy it a lot more than I've enjoyed some of the books in the Wheel of Time series. I listened to to the audiobook and I also read along a little bit as well. And I enjoyed being back in like the White Tower, which is where the Aes Sedai are from, and seeing some more Aes Sedai politics. Moiraine is one of my favorite characters, and so is Lan, so I enjoyed kind of having a full book dedicated to them. I did feel like we were going to get a little bit more Lan in this one, so I was disappointed when the focus was mainly on Moiraine. We do also closely follow Siuan Sanche in here, who is the Amelin seat when we start Wheel of Time, which is the leader of all of the Aes Sedai. So it was interesting because we know from the very beginning that Moiraine and Siuan are close friends. So it was good to actually kind of see them interacting in their earlier days before they became like such powerful figures in this world. But I expected this because it is a prequel novella. It's like a 395 page book. But I thought that we would have just something that you learned from reading this book that you didn't already know. And it isn't that. Like, you can read this as an introduction into Wheel of Time, and Robert Jordan kind of wrote this almost intended to be that. Like, you can start at book 1 or you can start at the prequel. It doesn't really matter which one you go. And this one actually might be a little bit more of a more gentle introduction into the series in terms of its readability. It's a little bit faster paced. It's a lot less slow. There's a lot less description in it. But then this was also a little bit of an easier read for me because I have already read 10 books in this series, so I'm quite familiar with the world building, so I could very quickly get myself established in the setting of this one. So I do think that this was enjoyable. Like, I liked it, but I expected it to give me just one thing, just one little snippet that you can't get from anywhere else than from reading this prequel. It doesn't even have to be important, just maybe like a little something that you get about the characters that really fleshes out that character that you don't really get anywhere else. But sadly, that didn't really contain any of this, and for that reason I gave it 3 stars. The next book that I read was one that I was very torn about while I was reading it. I ended up giving it a high 3-star rating, but I actually, in hindsight, I really enjoyed this one, so I think it's teetering on a border between like a 3 and 4 star for me, and that is Long Live Evil by Sarah Rees Brennan. So this was one that I was unsure whether I was going to love it or hate it, and I very much like wobbled backwards and forwards between the two throughout the entirety of this book. The letter from the author that I have, because this is the Fairy Loot edition, did give this a little bit of additional context as well, which I really appreciated, because this is about a girl who, I think she is 20, and she received a cancer diagnosis when she was 17. So she has been getting more and more sick and deteriorating across this entire time, and she's having like experimental treatment. Like, there's a little tiny bit of hope that she can be saved. And one day somebody turns up at her bedside and they tell her that all of her hope is gone, and she's going to find out from the doctors in the morning that there's nothing that they can do and she is going to die. So she can stay in this world and she can accept that, or she can travel into the pages of her favorite book. And if she can travel to the royal greenhouse and pluck the bloom of life and death, which blooms only once a year just for one night, then she can return home and she will be reinstated to health. Like, she'll get better and she can go on and live with the rest of her life. So our main character obviously doesn't believe that this is real and this is true anyway, so she's like, yeah, sure, whatever. And lo and behold, she finds herself in the pages of A Time of Iron, which is like a Game of Thrones style fantasy book series that her and her sister have read together over the last few years. But she ends up in the body of the villain of the story the day before the villain is supposed to be executed. So she very quickly has to turn this around, manipulate everyone to her cause, fix the wrongs that she knows the villain has committed in the story, like prior to her entering her body, to buy herself enough time to live until the bloom of life and death flowers and she can pick it and return home. The problem with this though is that she joins the narrative during the first book, which she actually hasn't read because I think her sister read it aloud to her when she was undergoing like a particular difficult part of her treatment. So she was kind of not really paying attention and more focused on like the existential dread of it all. And so she doesn't really know how the story goes. And throughout this, she's trying to preserve the story. So all of the characters end up up in the right place that they need to be for the rest of the series, while also going on her own side mission when she actually, like, her character in this story should now be dead. This can be particularly triggering, I would say, if you have any kind of health anxiety, because throughout this, the main character will kind of throw things back and compare things to, like, certain elements of her treatment. And the context that I actually gained when I read the letter at the beginning of this book is that Sarah Reese Brennan herself had, I think, a stage 4 cancer diagnosis. So she wrote this book as almost like a little bit of a self-insert at a time when she also wasn't sure if she was going to live. So that kind of going in with that context kind of explains some of the elements of this book, because some of the things that I didn't like is that it broke the fourth wall in a way where it felt that it was very obvious that it was the author's feelings that were being inserted into the page. Because like I said, this is a Game of Thrones style fantasy world that they're thrown into, but this entire thing is a little bit satirical, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, it's a little bit poking fun at the conventions of fantasy and the conventions of literature. And that is fine in the most part, like I got used to it. But what I didn't like is that there are certain parts where you can tell the author is coming through and inserting her opinion on, like, the publishing industry. Like, there's a bit in this where she says that, like, her favorite character in this world, the character says that her favorite character in the book series, because everything's really meta, is the Emperor, and how everyone kind of criticizes people who like the Emperor because he's so problematic, but it's okay to like problematic characters because that doesn't mean, like, that's not a reflection on you as a person and your sense of morality when we're talking about the real world. And I definitely agree with those points, but I don't want to encounter them when I'm reading a fiction book, you know? Like, I don't want the author's opinion on the publishing industry when I'm trying to read a fictional book. And then the main character, when she's traversing the fantasy world, is also kind of picking apart the conventions of fantasy in instances where, like, the first character she meets when she enters the story is called Key, and he is a palace guard, and she's like, okay, so people who are from the area of the world that he's from are given names based on important objects. However, this man was not named by his mother, he was named by an author, and so because he's called Key, that means that he has the keys to the palace and places where I need to go. So it was stuff like that that was really meta in here, as the main character is navigating this world as a character in it, but also at the same time very aware that she is in a story and she is a character in a book that somebody has written. I actually thought that those were the elements that I was going to like the least, but I actually thought that it was really fun, which is not a word that I ever use, in the parts where we were following our main character navigating a world that she knew was a story and trying to make her way through it as though it was like kind of a puzzle. But when it comes to this world actually being a high fantasy world is where I didn't love it. So we have a character in here called Marius, who I would say is the second most prominent character. He is kind of like your Templar character almost. He is a knight and a scholar. He is kind of like what the White Cloaks are supposed to be in Game of Thrones. He has taken like vows of chastity, and he is just the biggest, most moralistic bore, and he is the second most prominent perspective in this world. The difference between him and also our main character as well is that he is not aware that this is a story. This is his world. He's taking it very seriously, and in those portions, this book is just a high fantasy book, like a standard high fantasy, because this character has no concept or awareness of the fact that it's just a story and it's not a real place. And in that, it wasn't good. Like, it wasn't a good high fantasy story, and that I didn't love. So almost on a chapter by chapter basis, I was going from loving this book to kind of being bored and wanting to DNF, depending on who we were following. But I don't know, overall I just loved it. I really loved the romance as well. I really loved the plot twist at the end, and I also really loved how this main character like thought that she knew so much about this world and thought that and thinks that she knows what she's doing, and she's pretty much derailed at every turn. So yeah, I ended up loving this, but there are definitely big sections of it that I didn't love, mainly Marius and mainly its quality as a high fantasy book when you take away that element of it being a story and being very aware of itself. I then, after starting a bunch of fantasy series, I finished one which was the War of Lost Hearts series by Carissa Broadbent. So I read the third book, which is Mother of Death and Dawn. This was the final book in my current Patreon read along of the War of Lost Hearts series. In November we are starting the Lady of Darkness series by Melissa K. Rorich. But the War of Lost Hearts series is following a woman called Tasana who is a slave, and right at the beginning of the first book she frees herself from slavery slavery, and she goes to these magical orders and she asks them for help in freeing her friend who she had to leave behind, and also freeing all of the slaves. And she does this because she believes that the orders are a benevolent society that aren't allied to any kingdom and also have the ability to be able to do things like this. And they say that they will help her, but for a price. And they also say that she has to complete an apprenticeship, and they put her in the care of this reclusive fire wielder called Max. This is a fantasy romance, and Max and Tasana do grow closer throughout the course of the series. And something that I really like about this series is that there is a whole lot of like trauma recovery, which when that is embedded in a romance and like the characters have to grow to trust people in general, trust each other, become friends, and it grows into a romance. I really, really love that. It's the same kind of dynamic that Bryce and Hunt have in Crescent City, but they end up kind of going to the ends of the earth for each other to save each other, but also the world. And that element of this series, I really, really loved. By the time we get to book 3, we are obviously like very deep in the plot of this, and I have elements of this series that I really like the romance between Max and Tasana, like the world itself, like some of the perspectives we have. One of my favorite perspectives in this series is Ava, who is a character who's only introduced in book 2. But I also feel like there is an issue either with the pace of the plot or the structure of the plot in this series, because I feel like we have a lot of things or a lot of people that are built up to be great adversaries that we have to overcome. And when it finally comes to overcoming these situations or people, it's a lot easier than it should be. Like the characters overcome it more quickly than I feel like they should, and we're moving on to other plot points very quickly. And that was more of a problem in book 2 than it was book 3, but it did happen a little bit in this one. That being said, while the whole middle portion of the series was not my favorite, I really, really loved the end of this one. I thought that Carissa Broadbent did a very good job of wrapping up all of the individual like character arcs that were going on, as well as making some kind of hard decisions that I don't necessarily agree with when it comes to some of the characters. I wanted something a little bit different from them, but something that is like the harder choice, that is a little bit of a more bittersweet end. Then everybody kind of forgives each other and walks off hand in hand into the sunset. I feel like potentially in this series, based on how book 2 kind of changed the trajectory, I feel like either there was an issue with plotting and not knowing how to get the series from kind of like A to B. Like she knew what she wanted to do, but she didn't quite flesh it out enough and like stretch it out enough into ideally 4 books instead of a trilogy. Or she had a different idea of where the series was going to go and she kind of pivoted in book 2, which is why we have so many like really fast plot points resolving in the first 2/3 of book 2, I would say. So I feel like that was the main issue for me, but I did really appreciate the ending of this one. I gave it 3 stars, like a high 3, because it just didn't feel like a 4, but I did very much enjoy it. I like Carissa Broadbent's world building, and I also really like her writing. She gets compared to Jennifer L. Armentrout and Sarah J. Maas a lot, which I do kind of see. But I feel like, especially in terms of Sarah J. Maas, her plotting is definitely not as tight and not as intricate. I feel like the romance was very good, but the plot could have been a little bit more tightly woven and a little bit more intricate for me to enjoy it. But I definitely would read from Carissa Broadbent in the future, because what I read from this series I did actually really enjoy, and I do hope to start the Serpent on the Wings of Night series at some point soon. And then the final book that I read in October was my other 4-star. So I started and ended the month with a 4-star, and that was A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. So this one was my Patreon pick for October, and thank you so much to Vish for recommending this one to me, because I was a little bit trepidatious after reading Evocation, and I knew that it was different. Like I'd been told atmospherically, writing style, it was different. And just because I didn't love Evocation did not mean that I was not going to enjoy A Dowry of Blood. And guys, y'all were correct, because I really, really enjoyed this one. I started out listening to the audiobook, and I didn't actually intend to continue for the rest of it. I just put it on like to start the book while I was taking Bray out for a walk, but I actually enjoyed the audio narration so much that I listened to the whole thing, and I actually really would recommend the audiobook of this one. So I have not read Dracula. I'm just going to preface this review with that. But if you have not read A Dowry of Blood, it is either a retelling of Dracula or it is inspired by Dracula, as I have not read the original text. I don't know whether the like settings or any of the plot points mirror what happens in Dracula because I haven't read it. But in this story, we are following one of Dracula's wives, Constanta, and she is Dracula's first wife, we assume. When she meets Dracula, he is alone and she is dying. Raiders have come to her village and they have killed everybody, and he finds her dying on the floor and he turns her into a vampire and takes her with him. Now, she is just a poor village girl and he gives her this life of excess and this life of luxury and comfort that she has never experienced. He also saved her life when she was literally about to die, so she feels like she owes him a lot. She is enamored by him, she is in love with him, and over the years that starts to tarnish a little bit. We know that Dracula has a lot of secrets. He makes no secret of the fact that he has a bunch of secrets. There are areas of the house that Constanta can't go into, but ultimately she trusts him and she loves him, so she overlooks this for the longest time. And over time, Dracula also starts to bring more and more people into this family, and as the time goes on, Constanta is kind of like more and more aware of the fact that he is not a very good guy. He is gaslighting them, he's emotionally manipulating them, and everything that he does, it's not obvious, it's not overt, it's very much a, you can't do this for your own good. I'm doing this for you, I'm thinking of you, like that kind of direction. When it comes to the point where it isn't just Constanta involved in this relationship, she starts to change her mind a little bit more quickly, because it's not just her who is a victim of Dracula anymore, it is people that she has grown to love and grown to care about. So something that I really, really loved about this book is the atmosphere. I thought that it was very reminiscent of Gothic classics that I loved, like Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. In terms of the atmosphere and also the characters that we have, it reminded me a lot of Interview with the Vampire, which I still have not read the book, but I have watched the movie and the TV show. And in Interview with the Vampire, we have Louis, who is turned by Lestat kind of against his will. He very quickly becomes very morose because he doesn't want to live forever, and Lestat is gaslighting him. He's telling him like, oh, look at all of the wonderful things that you have, why are you so sad, like you need to get over it, like what about me, what about my feelings? And we very much had that kind of relationship between Constanta, the rest of the wives, and also Dracula in this book. So atmospherically, tonally, it was definitely on point. And then the audio narration of this by Kristen Atherton really had this layer of emotion in it. Like the words were infused with emotion that really brought the story to life, because this is a letter written to Dracula in hindsight about their relationship and everything that he has done to Constanta and the other people in this relationship to bring them to the point that they are at the end of the book. So it's quite poignant in and of itself. We have some, I want to say chapters, there's no chapters in this book, they're all like sections, like paragraph breaks, but there's some that are just a couple of lines on the page. Like this one says, even loneliness, hollow and cold, becomes so familiar it starts to feel like a friend. But then this one is like, desire makes idiots of all of us, but you already knew that part, didn't you? So it's directed at Dracula, and the audio narration has this like layer of fury infusing the narration that really like carries across the emotion and the atmosphere that S.T. Gibson is trying to create. So if you are an audiobook listener, like I would definitely recommend going that route with this one, because I really feel like it did add a little something extra that you don't get from just reading the text. In terms of where I stand with S.T. Gibson now, I love Dowry of Blood. I did not like Evocation. I have heard terrible things about the companion novel to this, which is inspired by / a retelling of Carmilla. So at this point, I might pick up that one. Is it called An Education Nimalis? Maybe. I might pick up the audio of that one, but I'm not gonna like hurry out the door to do so. But I'm definitely interested in what S.T. Gibson produces in the future, especially things that go down the line of more gothic atmospheric stories like A Dowry of Blood, as opposed to things that are a little bit more contemporary fantasy like Evocation. So these are all of the books that I read in the month of October, along with Meddling Kids by Edgar Cant's Hero, which I will have finished by the end of the month. I think that my review of all my thoughts on Meddling Kids will be included in my vlog that I'm going to finish filming before the end of October. But in terms of like in a wrap-up format, I will let you guys know what I thought of that one in November. But down in my comments, please let me know how your Spookoplathon went. I've seen a bunch of people in like rolls past 10, like on the 12th 13th, 14th rolls and even beyond that, and it's honestly so great to see. I hope you all had a wonderful Spookoplathon. I had a great time participating and getting to hang out with you guys in sprints throughout the month. So I really hope that it went a little bit better for you than it did for me, or that you at least just had a really good time participating. But if you guys would like to leave me a little comment to let me know that you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, please leave me a dog emoji for good old Tim from Meddling Kids. And aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram and my Patreon if you would like to join me on any of those. But that is it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.